Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Todd Eby. I'm the Manager of Project Review here at the Commission. We're going to get started with a couple announcements first. All participants are muted during the webinar. There's a chat box available that participants can enter questions in at any time, and there will be a question and answer session after the presentation. We're going to have two presenters today. Mike Appleby, the Supervisor of Groundwater Project Review at the Commission, and Jeff Thomas, a hydrogeologist in the Groundwater Project Review section. We're going to get started right now. I'll just introduce Andrew Dehoff, our Executive Director here at the Commission, and he would like to offer a couple remarks to start.
Thank you, Todd. Good afternoon, everybody. As I think you know, you're joining us for the third and for now the final webinar in our series related to SRBC's groundwater well regulatory program. Today's installment, I think, has some particularly interesting aspects to it, so I was glad to learn that registration has once again exceeded our expectations, and I hope that you will all find it interesting and useful as well. Why do I find this webinar interesting? Two reasons. First, as you see from the title slide, today's topic is water level monitoring. In my experience, water level monitoring in wells often takes a back seat to pumping data. You'll hear today about the importance of water level monitoring and how it complements pumping records to provide very useful information to manage your wells and to verify that they're operating the way you expect them to. The second interesting aspect of today's webinar is that we are making some exciting announcements, and you are among the very first to hear them. First announcement, as previewed in the title, and something I hinted at in my opening remarks during the previous webinar, today you'll hear information about a grant program that will begin April 1st. It's designed to assist groundwater projects in implementing water level monitoring, particularly for those projects that don't already do it or need upgrades. In my 25 years at the Commission, I can think of only one other grant program. It certainly had its benefits, but it was tied more to public information than technical assistance. I really think this opportunity will provide very tangible benefits to us and to projects like yours in managing groundwater wells for reliable and sustainable operations. So please take note of the information that you'll hear today and follow up if you think it's something you can take advantage of. My second announcement pertains to an action our commissioners took when they last met on March 12th. They directed staff to release for public review and comment some proposed changes to our regulations, along with 3 related policies geared towards our groundwater review practices. The rulemaking covers various aspects of our regulations, but of most interest to this group are efforts to clarify certain expectations for applications, to refine which sources actually require review and approval, along with making some changes to our renewal practices that, along with the new policies, should offer a notably more streamlined process for the renewal of long-term approvals. The draft rulemaking and the policies will officially hit the streets tomorrow, and they will be available for review through our website. Because you are on our mailing list, you should receive an email tomorrow with some more details. A particular note, we will hold 2 sessions, much like this one, to review the proposed changes with stakeholders so you can fully understand what we're trying to do and hopefully offer some timely comments. Again, the details will be in the email, but the sessions will be held April 6th and April 14th. There will be a hearing to receive comments on May 6th, and the comment period will be open through May 17th. And of course, our staff will be available at any time to answer questions. So please tune in to the proposed rulemaking and policies and let us know what you think about them. That concludes my announcements and my remarks. I thank you again for your interest and participation today. I hope you find the information as beneficial as we intend it to be, and look forward to your feedback, both through the evaluation survey that you'll receive following today's session, as well as feedback on the grant and rulemaking. Thanks again. Todd, back to you.
Thanks, Drew. At this time, I'll ask Mike Appleby to go ahead and start with his presentation.
Thank you, Todd. My name is Mike Appleby. I'm the groundwater supervisor here at the Commission. And we're going to go over, as Drew mentioned, this is the third of the three-part series for the groundwater project renewal process. These webinars are loosely based on the fact sheets that we have recently developed and are available on our website. If you've been registered for all three of these webinars, you've received a copy of each of these. If not, you can get the whatever fact sheet you have missed on our website. So I would ask that you check into the website periodically to check to see if there's been any changes on these websites or on these fact sheets. Even though we're providing them through email, we do expect that they're going to change a little bit as some of the policies and regulations change. As Drew mentioned, we have some things that may be coming up and may become effective at some point. So we would expect that these fact sheets would change to be consistent with any changes that may be enacted with those regulations and policies. So I think it's worth mentioning a little bit about what we've done for the first two webinars before we get into this one, because they all are very closely related, and there was a couple of key points in those that we want to make sure continue to be emphasized and are not forgotten throughout these processes. So as that first bullet says, the groundwater withdrawal application process is a two-step process. Step one is an aquifer testing plan or waiver request, and step two is the groundwater withdrawal application itself. So projects that have been in existence for a long time may have already met the requirements of 806.12 for the aquifer testing plan requirement. And if that's the case, if they've already completed a commission-approved aquifer test, then they may be able to move directly to the application phase and skip that first step, as it's already been completed, even though it was many, many years ago. Projects that didn't have a commission-approved aquifer test plan completed may still need to go through that first step with either an aquifer test plan or a waiver request. So if you're wondering if you have already completed step one, in many cases the docket will indicate if that's been the case. Otherwise, you can contact Commission staff to see where you fall, whether you've already done step one years ago or step one still needs to be completed. The Commission has been approving aquifer testing plans for a long time. We recently came across a project that had an aquifer testing plan approved from back in 1998. So it is possible that some of those older projects do have a previously approved test. We will be looking for some documentation to indicate that, but we were able to find it for that project. So it's something that is worth looking into if you think you may have that. It's also important from that first webinar that we did that we emphasized that the renewal application is due 6 months before the expiration of the approval. It's also important to keep in mind that the waiver or plan submittal does not count. So even though it's a two-step application process, it's really the application aspect of it that needs to be submitted 6 months prior to the deadline to meet the regulatory requirement. Otherwise, you can end up with some regulatory issues that we all would like to avoid. So the way the online application system works is that we start out with the planner waiver, and in an ideal world, we would have enough time to have that planner waiver reviewed and approved, and then the groundwater withdrawal application will become immediately available and will include some aspects of the planner waiver. Namely, it'll be who you are, well construction, and groundwater availability analysis information. But we realize that there are projects that may not have gotten started in this process early enough and need to have, need to have the groundwater withdrawal application available before they have completed the waiver or plan. For those projects, we still recommend that you get started with the planner waiver, work through at least those 3 sections that I talked about, and then we can release the application and make it available so you can hit that 6-month deadline. This is a question that I get, or an aspect that I get questions on periodically. So if you're a little confused by this, please give me a call and we can talk this process through. The second webinar was focused mostly on utilizing existing data and then collecting only the additional data that you need to fill data gaps. So there are generally three questions that we are intending to have answered through the application process. One is the withdrawal sustainable? Is the withdrawal going to cause significant adverse impacts to other users? Or is it going to cause significant adverse impact to the environment? Those are three fairly high-level questions, but they all need to be answered and resolved for this process before we can issue an approval, even for a renewal. So existing projects may have some of those questions answered through either historical testing data or historical operational data, but maybe they haven't received or haven't gotten all of those questions answered. And then commonly it's a surface water question that's missing, that surface water wasn't evaluated before. So that's often a data gap that we come across, and we are looking to have all those questions answered. So we think it's important enough to utilize the existing data to the extent that we can, that we recommend developing action plans, and the Commission will even do a voluntary action plan for projects that are eligible to participate in the Public Water Supply Assistance Program. Those projects, we will do that evaluation for them. We will identify what data they have and what data they may need to collect to support their renewal application. For some of those projects, an unintended consequence of the voluntary action plan was that we found that we've already done some of the evaluation that is necessary to support a withdrawal quantity. It may not necessarily be what they are looking for, but there may be a quantity that's supportable with existing data without having to do any additional evaluation. So for those projects, they can utilize SRBC's evaluation to satisfy any waiver requirements or hydrogeologic evaluation requirements, provided that they accept the results of the evaluation that we've done and don't collect any additional data. For projects that aren't eligible, we do recommend completing your own action plans for the renewals. And then, if you would like, we can still take a look at those action plans and provide some guidance or assistance, at least at a high level, to help ensure that you're moving along the right path. So for today, Jeff is going to be talking about a lot of the basics of water level monitoring, including the benefits of doing it and what to do with that data after you've collected it. So it's not just a matter of collecting and reporting it, but it's also important to look at that data, look at the long-term data to see what it's telling you. And finally, we're going to talk about the grant program that Drew mentioned earlier. So we're fairly excited to have that program be offered. We think that this water level collection is so important that we're willing to support that financially. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff so that he can talk about the basics of water level monitoring.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Jeff Thomas, a hydrogeologist in the Groundwater Group in the Project Review Program here at the Commission. So let's get started with what is water level monitoring. Today, we're specifically talking about the measurement of water level within an operational well. There's two important levels to consider in collection of data. The first is the static water level, which is the natural level of the piezometric surface within a well. For wells constructed within an unconfined aquifer, this is basically the level or elevation of the water table. For wells constructed within semi-confined or confined aquifers, this level could be higher, as the piezometric surface may be above the water table within the aquifer. For systems typically operating daily, the static water level measurement generally represents a high water level for the day. As far as the pumping level, this is the level of groundwater within the well during operation of the well. This level will vary depending on the pumping rate, the duration of pumping, and seasonal hydrologic conditions. And again, for systems operating on a daily basis, the pumping level will generally represent the well's daily low water level. Although it is important to realize that your static water level is what your static water level is, A daily low level will provide more valuable information regarding the impact that your withdrawal is having on the aquifer and potentially your well. So a couple questions that you may have asked yourself in the past or currently. Why is this required and who does it apply to? Why am I required to monitor water levels in my well? We've had many project sponsors who have had issues with their wells in the past. And when we've inquired as to their data and why they were collecting water level data, the answer often was, well, because you told us to. And although that probably isn't a bad answer, the requirement to do so technically falls under Commission Regulation 80630. And this regulatory requirement was established to protect aquifers, confirm proper operation of wells, provide protection to other users and the environment, and in part to ensure the sustainability of withdrawals over time. And more importantly, for why this webinar series was developed, water level data helps with the renewal process. Who is required to monitor? Well, every project, every groundwater project pretty much. This includes municipal or public water supply projects and non-municipal projects, such as private public water supply projects, commercial or industrial projects, natural gas projects, etc. Simply, if you have a groundwater withdrawal approval, you will be required to monitor groundwater levels in all wells as specified in your approval. As far as conditions of the approval, once a project is approved, each docket contains standard condition requiring the submittal of a groundwater elevation monitoring plan, or a GWEMP as we call it here. This plan will be reviewed and ultimately approved by staff. And there's some important things to know about these plans. One, this plan is intended to be brief. 1 to 2 pages is typically sufficient. We definitely don't need all 50 pages of the transducer specs, but it does need to be comprehensive of the entire system. So if you have multiple wells as part of your system, the plan needs to identify all system wells in which groundwater levels will be monitored. Now, the plan will indicate reference locations and elevations from where the groundwater levels will be measured, along with the make, model, and serial numbers of the level equipment used. It's also intended to explain the procedures for reading and recording water levels and methods for maintaining an accurate record of the data. And 2, to better help project sponsors develop approvable plans, the Commission recently finalized a guidance document to assist in this preparation called Guidance for the Preparation of a Metering Plan and a Groundwater Elevation Monitoring Plan for Water Withdrawals, Consumptive Uses, and Diversions. And this is accessible via the Commission's website under the Regulatory tab. So now that you're collecting data or you have existing data, what do you do with all this good data? The Commission requires proper record keeping and reporting of data. As far as the recording, a daily log should be kept of your groundwater elevation measurements. And this can be in paper form or electronic form, usually an automated computer-based database or system. And although a low water level is preferred, this potentially may not be convenient depending on the timing of run cycles throughout a day. Therefore, if a low level isn't possible, we normally recommend that the water level measurements be recorded at a consistent time each day. Systems that utilize supervisory control and data acquisition, or SCADA systems. These systems can be integrated with transducers to collect continual data. With automated systems, this becomes much easier when numerous measurements are collected daily and the lowest elevation can simply be selected. However, SCADA systems can also overwrite data depending on the amount of data being stored and your particular storage capacity. We've spoken with a number of project sponsors who thought they were properly storing data for years, only to find out their storage capacity was reached, and the data was actually being overwritten after a certain period of time. This is another good reason for submitting data to the Commission, as this can actually act as a backup data repository. For reporting, project sponsors are also required to submit daily water level or elevation data to the Commission on a quarterly basis via the monitoring and data website, or the MDW, and the web addresses for the reporting site and support are provided at the bottom of the slide. So what are the benefits of water level monitoring? Water level data is also a required part of renewals and waivers. Water level data should be used to assess ongoing performance of the well, evaluate longer duration impacts on the aquifer, and potentially provide insight into problems. And does the longer term data support previous test data that you might have? Anybody can do evaluations of this data simply in an Excel spreadsheet and then graphing the data. But if you ever have problems in doing this, Commission staff are always willing to provide assistance. So in this slide, here's an example of graphed long-term monitoring data that includes 2 drought periods. As you can see on this graph of historical operational data over time, the blue dots represent water levels, and the black line represents the 30-day average of withdrawals. The drought periods are indicated by the orange dashed vertical lines, and the 2 water-bearing zones by the dark dashed horizontal lines. Right in the middle, pretty much there, of the data. So what can you get out of graphing data such as this? One, with a long history of water level data, you can observe trends in how the water level reacts during drought or dry conditions. Here you can clearly see where water levels drop significantly during these drought periods. And 2, if you compare water level data to operational withdrawal data, how did water levels react to increases or decreases in demand? Again, it is very evident that increases or decreases in the withdrawal here cause water levels to decrease or increase respectively. Another key benefit of monitoring water levels, keeping track of your data can visually alert you to potential problems. This graphic again depicts groundwater levels and withdrawal data. This is pictured on the fact sheet and shows an example where operations of this particular well could result in the exposure of minor and major water-bearing zones, and probably are, and was getting dangerously close to the pump intake, represented by the solid dark horizontal line. As you can see, the withdrawals were fairly consistent. However, water levels continued to drop over time. So exposures of water-bearing zones like this could lead to decreased well yield, as this exposure can often cause the mineralization and ultimately reduced flow capability. Now, problems are not always so easy to recognize. In this example, shows how graphing long-term operational data can reveal problems that might not otherwise be very obvious if you're only looking at short-term trends. This particular project sponsor was collecting and tracking their data, but we're only looking at it on a weekly or a monthly basis. But if you only look at several months at a time, or even a couple of years, you may not sense there is a gradual problem occurring. Take note to the scale of the groundwater elevations on the right. The graphed water levels span 150 feet or more over the course of nearly 20 years. Shorter-term trends couldn't show what was happening over the long term. So if you break this data down to 5 to 8 year periods or so, and that's all you're looking at, you probably won't see the problem. If you look at the first few years of data, you'll probably see no problem. You have a fairly flat, consistent trend there with the yellow line. Later on down the road, you might see a slight downward trend, but you don't think too much about it. And toward the end of the data set, you'll still probably not quite see the problem. This data, when looked at over a relatively short span of time, doesn't look alarming. But you have to look at the whole period of record to recognize this problem. Unfortunately, because they weren't paying attention to the overall trend, they didn't see this problem coming and only recognized it when it was almost too late. In this case, an emergency situation arose with well 4, as the water level in that well came dangerously close to the pump intake. And as you can see toward the end of the data record, they were able to alter some usage that allowed some recovery of the water levels. As it turns out, their wells were basically living off of aquifer storage, and available recharge just wasn't sufficient enough to make up for that deficiency. The potential problem is easier to see here on this slide by the added trend lines. If you look at the later increasing combined withdrawals of the 3 wells on an annual basis, that is clearly having a gradual impact on overall water levels in these wells. Now, sometimes the answer can be right in front of you. Here, a transducer was set up in this well at a depth that wasn't low enough to capture the full span of fluctuating water levels. Once the water level fell below the transducer depth, in this case it was 116 feet below ground surface, all readings were constant for weeks, even months, as clearly recognized by the flattening of the water level data in orange. There was no way of knowing how far down the water levels were going, and in this case, the pump level was not far below this depth. So the take-home point here is don't just graph the data and walk away. It can be just as bad as driving your car without ever checking the oil. This problem was not hard to recognize if time was taken to look at the data. Now, how do you collect water level data? Groundwater levels can typically be measured in a couple different ways, examples of which are shown here. A couple different manual or automated methods. The manual method typically used is an electronic water level indicator, shown in the right photo. And 2 examples of automated methods, pressure transducer, shown in the middle, or an Airline, the pressure gauge of which is shown in the left photo. There are some important things to remember relative to your equipment and the collection of your data. First off, all equipment should be checked periodically to ensure accurate measurements. As far as frequency is concerned, 1 daily measurement per well is required. if using a pressure transducer or airline, your system may be set up to record numerous values each day, as I indicated earlier, but only one is required. Now, a question we often get is, when do I take the measurement? Although any time of the day is acceptable, staff encourage project sponsors to record the daily low and high level water levels, but only report the low. These measurements are typically taken just prior to the pump's run cycle, when it's off, or the water level is at its highest level, or the static water level, and then just prior to the end of the pump's run cycle, when it's on, or at its lowest level. As far as the measurement itself, groundwater elevations in feet above mean sea level is preferred. However, depth to water is also acceptable. But I strongly encourage, please do not report the height of water above transducer or any water column measurement. We still see a few project sponsors reporting these numbers, and that just doesn't help staff when reviewing and evaluating data, because we typically aren't privy to the set depth or elevation of the transducer, and that data is basically meaningless to us. Or as well, the transducer could be moved. So providing the actual groundwater elevation or a depth to water is greatly appreciated. So let's review some of the basic operations of this equipment and how you collect this data. A typical water level meter or indicator consists of a pair of gapped and insulated wires within a marked or graduated tape that is connected to an electrode, which is the end probe, and a source of power inside the unit, such as a 9-volt battery. So when that electrode contacts the water surface, the circuit is completed and an audible alarm will sound on the water level indicator, and usually along with a light as well. The water level is then determined by taking a reading directly from the tape at the top of the well casing or other benchmark location. Once you have your depth to water measurement, simply subtract the measurement from the top casing or benchmark elevation to determine the elevation of the water level within the well. Now let's look at airlines or bubbler systems. The airline or bubbler methods involve the installation of a small diameter pipe or tube, which is the airline, from the top of the well to a point below the lowest anticipated position of the water level during extended pumping periods. Under normal conditions, the water level in this pipe or tube should be the same as that in the well. To determine the depth to water, an air pump or compressor and a pressure gauge are attached to the top of the airline. Air is pumped into the line to force water out of the lower end. As the water level in the airline is depressed, the pressure indicated on the gauge increases. And when all the water has been forced out of the line and the air is shut off, and then the pressure gauge reading stabilizes and indicates the height of the water column originally in the airline. One issue you can run into is if you have a leak in your airline, and if that happens, the tube will begin to fill with water, and the gauge will continue to decrease, and eventually probably to zero. Converting a pressure gauge reading to a depth to water and eventually a groundwater elevation is a fairly easy calculation. One unit conversion is necessary to know, and that is that 1 pound per square inch, or PSI, is equal to 2.31 feet of water, regardless of the well diameter. There are two typical airline gauges. The first is a standard PSI gauge. The gauge reading in PSI can be converted to a height of water by multiplying the pressure reading on the gauge by 2.31. Some gauges, as pictured on this slide, read both PSI and height of water. And in either case, the depth of water can then be calculated by subtracting the height of water from the total airline depth, or the length. Another slightly more sophisticated gauge is the direct reading gauge. The direct reading gauge has a rotating scale with both airline depth and depth to water, where the math is basically built into the scale. The scale is then rotated until the zeroed needle matches the depth of the airline, and then once pressurized, the needle will point to the actual depth of water, and thus no calculation is necessary. Finally, the groundwater elevation can be calculated by subtracting the depth to water from the known measuring point elevation. How about pressure transducers? Pressure transducer senses changes in pressure measured in PSI again, exerted by a column of water above an internal strain gauge or a sensing diaphragm within the transducer. This is translated electronically to a 4 to 20 milliamp signal sent to a data logger, and software calibration coefficients unique to each transducer enable the logger to convert this 4 to 20 milliamp output to meaningful results in the desired units. So there are two main types of pressure transducers. There's vented and non-vented. And in vented transducers, the strain gauge, or the diaphragm, is exposed to the same barometric air pressure so that it will self-compensate for barometric changes. A non-vented transducer has a vacuum seal on the back of the sensor, so it does not self-compensate for barometric changes, and has to be compensated using a separate barometer. Transducers can be programmed to display in formats including level depth, typically of the transducer, level surface elevation, either ground surface or top of casing, or level depth to water. And the calculation of the groundwater elevation is specific to each selected setup option. And again, data gathered with an absolute or a non-vented sensor must be post-corrected to subtract the barometric pressure. So in summary, the Commission regulates and requires monitoring of and recording and reporting of water level data. The collection and reporting of this data is clearly outlined in all new approvals. And remember, there is guidance available on our website to assist you in preparing groundwater elevation monitoring plans. And to make it even easier, a link to the guidance will also be provided in the frequently asked questions in a few days. I can't stress enough the benefits of gathering as much water level data as you can, especially if coming in for a renewal and or a waiver request. The data you collect and report should provide sufficient evidence to support your request. And please keep an ongoing data graph to track trends over the length of your data to allow you to identify any issues that could cause you more headaches, time, and money. And as always, if you ever have any concerns or questions, you can always contact staff for assistance, or if you have a question now, please type it into the chat box. Thanks for your time, and I'll hand it back over to Mike to provide a few details of our forthcoming grant program.
Thank you, Jeff. So now we'll get a chance to talk about some of the money that's available. So hopefully everybody is stuck around in anticipation of this. As Drew mentioned, the Commission believes that it's very important to collect water level data and would like to support that collection of data with this grant program so that systems can better resource or better manage their resource, and also to help them through the renewal process. Yeah, so the projects that are eligible for this are pretty much almost every project with the exception of remediation projects. So if you have any kind of an approval, if you have a grandfathering certificate, or if you're seeking approval from the Commission for the first time, you may be eligible for this. So we would recommend that anyone that thinks it might be eligible either contact Commission staff or submit their application. So we're currently working on finalizing the criteria for development. That will also be posted with the grant application when it becomes available on April 1st. Some of the things that we're going to be considered include how soon the next renewal is, where the project is located. For example, if it's in a potentially stressed area, water challenged area, or an environmental justice area. There's going to be a few other criteria, so pay attention for that when that does come out. The way the grant will work is that you'd submit an application to us based on the link that's provided to you in email or on our website. It is an online application that consists of about 20 questions. We'd expect that you'd be able to complete that in one sitting because there's some very basic questions about who you are and what the money will be used for and the type of equipment that's going to be purchased. You would receive the award, then including the amount that would be eligible for. Then you complete the work and submit your receipts for reimbursement. So we're expecting that any work that's completed on or after April 1st of 21 will be eligible for the grant. So if you have something in the plans for the next couple of months before we actually award the notice or the grant money, then you can continue to work through that. Of course, if we haven't reviewed and approved your application, there's still a chance that we wouldn't approve that, but I guess you were going to be installing that stuff anyway, so any assistance you could get on that would probably be helpful. The one caveat to all of this is that if you participate in this program, then you would be required to report the water level data to us so that we can maintain that database for you for the renewal process. The grant program is going to be open from April 1st through June 30th, so that's when you get your applications in. And it's not an April Fool's Day joke. You actually do have the opportunity to get some money from the Commission. We're not looking to award anything sooner than August 2nd, so once you submit it, you just hang tight for a little while and wait for us to work through all the applications that we get. We're looking at $1,500 per source and $7,500 per facility, with the total amount to be between $100,000 to $120,000. So there's a fair amount of money available. We wanted to be able to spread it out to as many facilities as we can. So you might ask what a facility is. Well, we've got a very long definition in our regulations about what facility is, so I thought I'd try to simplify it just a little bit. And it's basically an independent system. So if it's a public water supply system, it may have one ID. It might be one golf course, or if you are a commercial system or a manufacturer, it's that property that's supplying water for your process. So it's all those wells that combine into that, and that's what we would consider a facility. The types of things you can use the money for is going to be to get started on water level monitoring if you haven't been doing it already, to upgrade or replace equipment, improving your accuracy. It can even be used for software upgrades and additional storage requirements if that's necessary. So I'd recommend that you contact staff with any questions, but there's going to be more information available on that come April 1st, and I would imagine, like Drew said, that everybody that's on this registration will get an email about this. So the next thing, this is a slide that you've seen before. It has some additional resources that are available. As with anything, contact us and we can help you work through your questions. I wanted to take a minute to highlight a couple of the important dates. As just mentioned, April 1st is when the grant program becomes available. Drew mentioned April 6th and April 14th as being the dates for the webinars to review the draft policy and draft regulation revisions. As he mentioned, that we think that these regulations and policy changes are going to be very important. It's probably going to apply to several people on this webinar. So we'd recommend that you attend at least one of those and comment on those regulation changes if you so desire. But we think that they're going to be significant and most of them should be appreciated. We're also looking at a summer webinar series. So right now we've got most of our feedback regarding offer testing plans and the implementation of offer tests. So that's something that we'll be considering for the future, and also Any feedback that you may provide on this webinar will also be used to help identify future webinar topics. So at this point, I'm going to ask for anybody that has any questions to go ahead and populate those into the chat feature, so Todd can collect those questions and then report out on what we have. While that's happening, I'll take just a minute to summarize some of the key aspects of this webinar. So as Jeff mentioned, we do think that the water level data collection through normal operation helps not only the project sponsor operate their source better, but also helps them and us work through the renewal process easier. We want to make sure that people have the type of data that they need to get through the renewal process, and we also don't want an emergency that may be predictable to come up if it could have been avoided by monitoring this water level data. So we're suggesting you do more than just collect and report the water level data. We're asking you to look at it, to graph it. And as Jeff mentioned, if you need some help with the graphing aspects of it, we can set something up for you to do that. And finally, just to recap on the grant program, April 1st, we've got about $100,000 available. So ask anybody to go ahead and submit their application when that becomes available. So I'll turn it over to Todd with any questions that we may have.
Thanks, Mike. Before we get to the questions and answers, I just want to mention a few things in case somebody's going to need to leave early. This is the last of our three-part groundwater renewal series. We want to thank you for participating. We will be sending out an electronic survey afterwards, and please take a look at that. And it will only take a short amount of time, a couple of questions that helps us tailor our future webinars and training events. This session is being recorded, as we mentioned previously, and we will be developing a frequently asked questions and FAQ document that we will make both the recording and the FAQ available on our website in the next couple of weeks. The session materials from the webinars 1 and 2, held in January and February, are currently available on our website if you wanted to go back and look at some of those or listen to the webinar, or if you missed it when we had presented it. So I'll start with the questions that we've received so far. The first one indicates that the project draws water from a quarry in Hershey. And the question is, how does this monitoring change if they don't draw from a well? So there are certain groundwater sources that are not a well, and a flooded quarry is a good example of one of those. And so in those situations, the Commission evaluates the monitoring requirements for that type of source, and monitoring can be achieved in a flooded quarry by installing a stilling well, but because you can actually view the water surface often, there are instances when even something like a staff gauge can be installed to measure and record the water levels in a source such as a quarry. So I'll see if Mike has anything he wants to add on that.
No, it's just good to start off with an unusual and a little bit more difficult question than what we would normally see for water level monitoring. And so you might ask, why would you want to monitor water level in the well in a quarry when the volume might be so large compared to your withdrawal? And I would imagine there are some cases where we may not require that to happen, but there's also cases where the recharge to the quarry isn't as quick as may be expected, and so even still collecting water level data during those times may be important. So that can end up being kind of a site-specific question that we would have to resolve.
Great, thanks, Mike. The second question we had here is, when continuous monitoring equipment is being used, how frequently should a water level measurement be required?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is it may depend a little bit on what the circumstances are and how often you're utilizing the source. So what we often are recommending to people is if they have the capability to collect every 15 minutes or every hour, then that's a good interval to do it. If you start getting too much more data than that, then you're probably going to fill up your storage on your software before you'd want to. So that may require too much storage space. So I think that can be a somewhat variable question and variable answer based on specifics of each system. And some of it may even depend a little bit on how you operate it. The most important things, I think, are getting that maximum water level each day. And so it may be that you record it for a short period of time at 15-minute or hour intervals, and then periodically you go back through and pick off some of those deeper water levels for each day, just so that you are maintaining that record someplace, and maybe it's a little bit more condensed version. So, I think there's value in doing it in a couple of different ways, and it's probably a little bit of a matter of preference on how you'd like to do it.
Thanks, Mike. Next question is, will water level grants be available to grandfathered registered facilities? And I'll go ahead and answer that one. That grandfathered facilities that are registered are eligible for preparing and submitting an application for water level monitoring. So you can take a look at the information when it's up on our website on April 1st, and it will explain all those eligibility requirements for those projects. So. Next question is, what if we do not know the length or depth of the air tube used to check the well depth?
Yeah, this is a question we get fairly often, and there's a couple of answers to this depending on what you have available to you. So some people will actually need to pull the water, that airline out and measure it to see what it is. Others that have some room may be able to put a transducer or a water tape down the well to get a confirmation of what the depth of water is, and then that can then be compared to the water column that the airline is indicating is present. And once you know that, what that water column is and the depth of water, then you can calculate where the bottom of that airline is, or maybe in a worst case scenario, you can calculate where the bottom of the airline is leaking. Because in some cases when you have an airline that's been in place for a long period of time, in some cases they will start to leak, and you'll get a water level that corresponds to that leaking point instead of the actual bottom of the airline.
Great. Okay, that was the last question we have in the chat box. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and type them in there. While we're waiting, I'll just go over a couple items that I mentioned previously. We will be sending out that electronic survey afterwards. It's a short survey. It's very useful for us to get some feedback so we can understand what projects are interested in hearing about and learning about, what sessions may be interesting for them. So we ask that you fill that out. Like I said, the information from parts 1 and 2 of the webinar series are already up on our website. We'll be making this session's recording and a FAQ available on our website in the next several weeks. And I don't see any more questions coming in. So I guess if there are no more questions, I just want to mention that the draft regulation should be up on our website tomorrow. We expect that they'll be up on our website tomorrow. We'll be sending out some emails to make projects and consultants aware of these new regulations that are draft and we're out for public comment. We ask that you take a look at those and provide any comments if you so you have some that we should consider. And then I want to just repeat that the water level grant program announcement, formal announcement, will be going out on April 1st, and there should be information available on our website at that time. So thanks again for participating in the last webinar of this series.